Welcome to the Veritas Podcast election special. It is the 2022 midterm elections, which will be this evening. This episode is going to come out Tuesday morning. It is being recorded Saturday, November 5th. So we're going to have predictions and analysis for you. But I will say, if you want my final predictions, make sure to follow me at Scott_Veritas on Twitter, because I'm going to post my final predictions for the midterms there Monday night. But I will have pretty much almost final, like 98% final predictions for you today. But of course, it is the midterm elections. I'm here with my co-host, Ben Rebellis, to chat about that. We've got, I think, 33 Senate seats up for election, something like 36 governorships, and the entire House of Representatives. I'm just going to get right into it in terms of predictions, because that's probably what you guys want to know this morning before the polls close. I'm going to start by saying that the House of Representatives is the thing that is the easiest to predict. It would appear that Republicans are heavily favored to take control of the House of Representatives, and I do believe that they will do that. I'm predicting something like a 20-seat swing. I think they have 212 seats right now. I think they'll finish with about 232, give or take a few seats. It's always hard to predict the exact number of House seats because there's 435 of them total. But at the end of the day, the magic number in the House, in the Senate, it's 50 or 51. In the House, it's 218. And I think that they're going to have about 15 more seats than they need at the end of the day. So Republicans will probably take control of the House of Representatives. Certainly, if they somehow don't and Democrats retain control of the House of Representatives, it will be a very bad night for Republicans. That's kind of a bare minimum, I think, for Republicans this evening. The more interesting thing to talk about is the Senate. So the Senate is very interesting. I'm going to go through the races one by one in terms of what I think is going to happen. And I'm going to go through really the races that are even slightly competitive. I'm obviously not going to talk about every race. There's a Senate election in California that's going to go to the Democrats. New York, go to the Democrats. Alabama is going to go to Republicans. I'm not going to talk about races like that are completely safe. I'm going to talk about the ones that actually have some intrigue. So we'll start in Florida, which did have a little bit of intrigue at the beginning of the cycle. Val Demings is the Democrat there. She's a former police chief and a current congresswoman. Democrats were pretty excited about her candidacy, but ultimately the polling has shifted strongly in Marco Rubio's favor. Marco Rubio is the incumbent who's up for re-election. You probably all know who he is. He ran for president a few years ago. Rubio's a pretty uncontroversial, pretty popular guy. Florida is trending Republican. It seems to be a Republican year. I think that will go to Republicans in Florida. And I'm going to put the map on the screen, by the way. You guys should be able to see what the predictions are and kind of what I'm talking about. Let's go to Georgia. I'm going to go actually in order of what's on my map here. Georgia is interesting. Georgia is kind of a coin flip, according to most election analyzers. And Nate Silver at 538 actually has Georgia going to Republicans right now. I think Georgia is going to go to the Democrats as of the time of this recording. This is one that could flip in the map that I post Monday evening on my Twitter. But I do think Georgia will go to the Democrats almost exclusively because the candidate that Republicans have in Georgia is former Dallas Cowboys running back Herschel Walker. That description doesn't really do him justice. Herschel Walker, as I've mentioned previously on the show, has sort of been conspiracy theorizing that he is a member of the Georgia State Police and has been waving around a police badge on stage at debates. Couldn't make that up if I tried. And he has been accused by multiple women of asking them to get abortions and paying them to get abortions when he was sleeping around, I think in like the late 90s and early 2000s, towards the end or shortly after his football career. This is despite the fact that he is staunchly pro-life. He's just kind of off his rocker. He's kind of been a lunatic his entire campaign. He hasn't run a very good campaign. The Democratic senator there, Raphael Warnock, I don't think is an excellent candidate. He is to the left of Georgia politically. But at the end of the day, I'm going out on a limb in this race for now, and I might change this race to being a Walker victory because he is slightly ahead in the polls. I might change this race Monday night in my final map. But for now, I am going with my gut that says that you cannot post a candidate as poor as Herschel Walker in a competitive race and still win. He's a pretty awful candidate, and I do think this one will go to the Democrats as of the time of recording. A little bit north of Georgia, we have North Carolina, which is a race that was supposed to be competitive, but I have absolutely put it in the Republican column. I'm very confident that this will be a Republican victory for Ted Budd, who's the Republican candidate there. Not even going to talk about the Democrat. The polling in this race has shifted way right in the last 2 weeks, and it looks like Republicans will win this open seat in North Carolina where Richard Burr is retiring. Let's go up to Pennsylvania. This is a really interesting race and is one that could absolutely flip in my Monday night map. So you have John Fetterman and you have Republican Dr. Oz. I refuse to call him Mehmet Oz. I have known him as Dr. Oz my entire life when my mom would watch him on Oprah, and I will keep referring to him as Dr. Oz. Perhaps soon Senator Oz, but in my opinion, most likely not. I have this still going to John Fetterman for now. This one could absolutely flip, though. It's about as close as it gets. This looked like a safe seat for Democrats for a while because Oz's campaign was doing very poorly. He is a carpetbagger. He is not from Pennsylvania. He is not very popular in Pennsylvania. But then John Fetterman, the lieutenant governor of Pennsylvania and the Democratic candidate, had a stroke in the spring or over the summer, and he has really struggled cognitively since then, and there have been questions about his health. This race has shifted somewhat towards Oz in recent weeks because John Fetterman had a pretty terrible debate performance after his stroke. There was only one debate that he agreed to attend, and as I'm sure everyone watching saw, because it was all over the place, he did not really do a good job of even stringing sentences together in that debate. And this one's going to be close. I think at the end of the day, if there were a stronger Republican candidate here than Dr. Oz, and by the way, there was a perfectly good generic Republican who nearly beat Oz in the primary, but of course Trump swooped in here and endorsed Dr. Oz at the last minute, putting him over the edge. I think with a better Republican candidate, this would actually be pretty safe because Fetterman's stock has gone down since his stroke symptoms have kind of made people wary of him being their senator. But at the end of the day, for now, and this could change in my Monday evening map, you can go check me out on Twitter at Scott_Veritas if you want to see that final prediction. For now, I have this going to the Democrats. The race in New Hampshire is really interesting. Maggie Hassan is the Democrat there. This race was supposed to be kind of a lock for Democrats, but in recent weeks, the Republican candidate, Don Bolduc, who is one of the there was a movie that came out a few years ago about the horse soldiers of Afghanistan. I don't know how much truth there is to it. I haven't seen the movie, but it's supposedly about a group of soldiers who fought on horseback in Afghanistan. I'm sure there's some truth to it. It just sounds a little bit sensationalized. He was one of those soldiers, and he is a former general in the Army. He's also a pretty Trumpy conspiracy theorizing candidate. He wasn't supposed to do particularly well in this race. He did beat a much safer, more establishment Republican in the primary. I still think this race is going to be in the Democratic column at the end of the day, but it's become really interesting, and I could actually flip this one in my Monday evening map depending on how the polling comes out, because the polling has shifted strongly towards Bolduc in recent days. We'll go to Ohio. This is a really interesting race. I think in a year that wasn't looking so favorable to Republicans that Democrats would win this race. They have a really good candidate, Congressman Tim Ryan, who has been very moderate, not particularly woke. He has really tried to be an Ohio candidate because Ohio has been trending strongly Republican in recent years. Tim Ryan's a good candidate, but it's a Republican year. Ohio's a Republican state. The Republican candidate is J.D. Vance, who is the author of Hillbilly Elegy, who is, in my opinion, one of the best candidates Trump has ever endorsed. I think two of his best endorsements came this cycle. He endorsed J.D. Vance and Blake Masters, who I actually like, and I'm going to talk about in a minute in Arizona. So thank you to Donald Trump for making some endorsements that actually were not terrible for once. But J.D. Vance, I think, is ultimately going to win this race, albeit more narrowly than he should, because he has an excellent Democratic opponent. There was some worry on the Republican side about this race until maybe the last few days. The J.D. Vance lead in the polls was only maybe 2 or 3%. It's ticked up a little bit to like 4 or 5%, which is usually pretty safe when you have a polling lead like that in the polling average. He also struggled with fundraising because he's a first-time candidate. He's an author. He's not a politician. I do think pretty strongly, though, at the end of the day, that J.D. Vance will maintain this seat for Republicans after Rob Portman has retired. Another race that is pretty interesting is in Wisconsin. You have a fairly progressive candidate, the lieutenant governor of Wisconsin, Mandela Barnes, here. You have the very, very conservative and significantly to the right of the state of Wisconsin incumbent Senator Ron Johnson, who has been somebody who has pretty strongly supported the conspiracy theories of Donald Trump surrounding the 2020 election. This is a fairly close race, I think, that could be a lot closer than a lot of people expect, but I do agree with the conventional wisdom at this point and the 538 Nate Silver forecast. If you look at that online, that's a good thing to look at for these sort of things. I do agree that Ron Johnson's going to win re-election here. He has a pretty solid lead in the polls. Wisconsin's a swing state. He's not quite as controversial as a Herschel Walker or a Dr. Oz. He is an incumbent senator. He has ran a pretty good campaign there and raised a good amount of money. I do think he's going to win re-election and that Republicans will keep that seat. Colorado is one that I think is going to remain in the Democrats column. You have the relatively moderate, or at least sort of moderate in temperament senator there, Michael Bennet for the Democrats. This is a race that I do think definitely Democrats are going to win, and that most people agree Democrats will win, but it's just barely competitive. There has been some polling to indicate that the Republican Joe O'Dea, who is a fairly moderate Republican, could make this competitive. If Republicans win Colorado on election night, you know that it is not a Republican wave. It is a tsunami. This is one to watch, because if it is even within a couple of points of going to Joe O'Dea, the Republican, that is a bad sign for Democrats. So I would watch this race because it's the sign of wave versus tsunami. This should absolutely be in the Democratic column, barring a absolute Republican wipeout. Arizona is a really, really interesting race. You have a moderate Democratic Senator, Mark Kelly, the husband of former Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords, who was the victim of an attempted assassination back in 2011. He's also a former astronaut. He's a really good candidate. People like him in Arizona. He is leading in the polls. He has been fairly moderate on certain questions like abolishing the filibuster. I certainly hope that Blake Masters, the Republican, a teal capital guy and somebody that Trump has endorsed, and as I mentioned before, is actually a pretty good Trump endorsee as far as Trump endorsees go. Blake Masters is sort of part of the Chris Rufo clan. He really believes in taking the fight directly to wokeness by wielding the power of government. I'm a big fan of Blake Masters. Ultimately, I think he's going to lose this election, but he could win. This is another one that could maybe flip in my Monday evening map, my final map. I think that Blake Masters is just going to come up a little bit short in this race, but man, am I pulling for him. I do like Blake Masters a lot. I'd love to have him on the show at some point. So Blake is great. I hope he wins this race, but I am going to give this one to the Democrats for now. Just west of Arizona, you have Nevada. This is one where I know Republicans have been trying to win a statewide race in Nevada for quite some time and have struggled. I do think they're finally going to get their wish. Adam Laxalt is the Republican here. There's not a whole lot to say about this race. It's pretty straightforward. You have a straightforward Republican candidate versus a one-term Democratic incumbent in a swing state. It's a Republican year. Adam Laxalt is leading in the polls by about 3%, and I think he's going to flip this race for Republicans. Finally, one last race I wanted to talk about is in Washington. This is just like Colorado. This is one that if you see it getting close, it absolutely means that we are in a very bad situation for Democrats and a very good night for Republicans. Tiffany Smiley, the Republican here, has had some polls that show her within 3 or 4 points of the Democrat, Patty Murray. This should go to the Democrats. I have it going to the Democrats. I don't think I'm going to change it. It's going to go to the Democrats, I do believe. But if it is at all close, and certainly if it does flip Republican, we are in a Republican tsunami situation. These are the competitive races. That pretty much does them. At the end of the day, what you're wondering, though, is who's going to control the frickin' Senate when all is said and done. My map says that the Democrats will actually retain very narrowly, by the narrowest of margins, control of the Senate. As of now, this might actually change by Monday night. Again, I'm going to post those final predictions. But I think Democrats, according to my current math, are going to I believe there's not going to be a net change in the Senate. It's going to remain a 50-50 Senate, which means you kind of get a de facto moderate Senate because Joe Manchin, the very moderate Democratic senator from West Virginia, can pretty much control the agenda because his vote kills anything the Democrats want to do. I think it's going to stay about that, but it absolutely could be taken over by Republicans. Only one of my predictions that currently goes to the Democrats has to go to Republicans for them to take control of the Senate. So that's what I think is going to happen in the Senate. Ben, do you have any thoughts on any of those races that I was talking about?
So I am not going to be posting any maps.
Ben is the legal mind. We're going to talk about what we can actually do in Congress if Republicans take over later, and I think Ben will have a lot to contribute there. But I will be our official election analyst. But I'm curious, Ben, if you have any thoughts on any of that stuff.
So this is all like so I was recently in Vegas. That's where I was on vacation. And you go to the roulette wheels, and they have this actual sign that posts, like, what are the previous numbers that hit? And any good gambler knows those don't mean anything because any number is equally likely. And this is very similar feeling to that. Just like, I don't know what's going to happen. Like, since 2016, it's like, oh, well, we're going to put some numbers out there, and then they just end up being something different. But there's one theme I feel like I felt while you're talking about this, Scott, is Democrats should have done better. I felt like you've said this a couple times where it was Democrats should do well here, and then they haven't because Republicans have had the better message and Democrats have no message. And I can kind of go on about this a little bit later, but the Democrats' affirmative case is not persuasive. The affirmative points that they have are things that people don't really agree with. And so now we have all of these races that Democrats probably should have won, and now they're toss-ups. Now they are vulnerable. And this seems to be a theme across the country that Democrats should have been winning, and they're not.
I feel like it kind of goes both ways. I think that Democrats, it's funny because you would think it'd be binary. I think Democrats and Republicans should both be doing better, like in a way, because I look at a candidate like John Fetterman. Clearly, there actually are ways to replace a candidate who has already been nominated on a ballot. You can do that. You can't do it in the last 2 weeks of a race, but you can do it a few months in advance. It had to be done in 2002 when a Democratic senator died. He was actually replaced by former Vice President Walter Mondale, who went on to actually lose a Senate race in Minnesota. You can replace the candidate. This probably should have been done with the candidate John Fetterman because he is struggling a lot cognitively. I don't want to be.
Did you watch that debate?
I did, and I'm sure a lot of the audience did, and it was rough. I wish nothing but the best for John Fetterman, but I also, certainly if I were in Pennsylvania, I would be voting for Dr. Oz. Despite the fact that I don't think Dr. Oz is a great candidate, I do not think we should have senators who are in the kind of health state that John Fetterman is. He's clearly not in good shape mentally and cognitively, and I wish him the best. But that is something that the Democrats should have treated differently, or they should have not had him debate is the other thing, is that he just shouldn't have been trotted out to debate like that. And of course they would have had to deal with people coming out and saying, there would have been ads from the Oz campaign. And this is very common in politics to have ads like this, which is like, John Fetterman doesn't want to debate me. What's he afraid of? You take a little bit of a hit for that. Those ads are maybe a little bit effective, but it wouldn't have been nearly as big of a deal as what has actually happened, which is that this race has become a toss-up pretty much exclusively because of Fetterman's stroke and because people can really see through that debate the effects it's had on him cognitively.
Yeah,
that was a big.
Real quickly, I'm dealing with a case right now where my opposing party has aphasia, which is which I think Fetterman is suffering from, which is what happens after a stroke, where it's not that you're not intelligent enough. It has nothing to do with that. It's just you're reaching for those words constantly. So I interviewed this opposing party recently and I could see it. And then watching this Fetterman debate, you can see it right there. It's not that he doesn't know. He's just reaching so hard. And then when he can't get there, he just gives up. I think that answer that he gave about fracking is really a good example.
The worst. I mean, it was
terrible. He wanted to elaborate on it more, and he just couldn't get there. So he just said the same thing over and over. It's sad, actually. I think this guy's probably a decent person, politician, whatever, but he just can't do it. It's very sad to watch.
Yeah, at the end of the day, senators and governors are explainers in chief, and they do have to be able to speak clearly to their constituents. It's a sad thing, but and look, I am not a doctor. For all I know, John Fetterman has a very good prognosis, and his ability to orate and to speak could improve significantly after he is elected to the Senate, if he is elected to the Senate. I'm not going to pretend that I know the medicine behind stroke recoveries, but that debate was fucking rough. I mean, and it was shocking that he was allowed to debate by his campaign team, by the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee. That if Dr. Oz does win that race, and he might, even though I'm not predicting it, I do think it's possible, it will go down as one of the worst choices by any campaign apparatus in the history of statewide politics in the United States. That was a terrible choice to put him on that stage. I also think that, Democrats should be doing better in a lot of these races. Like Tim Ryan is a candidate that in theory should beat J.D. Vance just because he's done a really good job of sort of playing down the middle and being moderate in a Republican state. But I don't think the Democrats have coalesced around his message. The Democrats have been hysterical about this election is an apocalypse, even though it's pretty routine for the president's party to do poorly in midterms. And they've just been, and Joe Biden had Dylan Mulvaney, the trans, I don't know exactly what's going on there. Person, if you don't know who Dylan Mulvaney is, just you look him up on Twitter and you'll see some interesting videos, or look up his interview with Joe Biden. His or whatever.
You can see him frolicking through the woods.
Yeah. I mean, this was the closing pitch.
Girl.
This was the closing pitch of the Biden campaign, was to have Dylan Mulvaney they had Dylan Mulvaney interview Joe Biden. And of course, he asked him, like, do you support gender affirming care for children? Joe Biden was like, yeah, absolutely, totally. And, this undermines candidates like Tim Ryan, who actually are running a middle of the road campaign. And it could cost Democrats a lot of seats that they otherwise might have run. But this gets to an interesting thing that I've been thinking about, Ben, which is if we see what seems to be the most likely scenario, which is a Republican victory, whether it's a wave or a tsunami or maybe just kind of a ripple, it remains to be seen. But it seems like Tuesday is going to be an overall good night for Republicans, where they will maintain at the very least a sort of like Joe Manchin filibuster type Senate, or maybe even take control of the Senate. And, if it's 50-50, like I said, it'll be the sort of Joe Manchin, like almost purple Senate situation. And they will probably take control of the House. It seems like they're going to have a good night. It's been hard to tell for me, and I really wonder what your kind of take on these vibes is, Ben, what it's going to mean. Like, do we think this has to do with the culture war, or is it more about the economy? Because right now the economy, people know there's going to be a recession soon. It's been upsetting for a lot of people, and it seems like a lot of places have put in place hiring freezes. There's going to be layoffs. It's getting ugly. Inflation is really bad. So the economy is clearly a factor. And I fear that, especially if Republicans don't do particularly well on Tuesday, they just kind of have like a ripple, like they just sort of, like pretty much what I'm predicting, which is that they solidly take over the House and they do like fine in the Senate, where they don't lose seats, but they don't gain them either. Although, by the way, I do think Republicans are going to do great in governor elections. I'm not going to go through all the governor elections individually, but I'm predicting currently that, and I will put my governor map on Twitter for those of you who are curious, I'm predicting that Republicans will win 30 governorships out of 50 on Tuesday night. So, I think they're going to do well in a lot of places, but if it's not a tsunami, I will wonder if maybe it's just kind of a typical, like, hey, the economy's not doing great. It's a midterm. The president's party always does poorly in midterms. Like, can Republicans really claim victory on the culture war if there's anything short of like a tidal wave of victories for them? Or do you think that's the right way to read it? Like, maybe no matter what, it would appear that, the stuff that's going on with critical race theory and gender ideology has played a factor. Like, how much of this do you think is economic versus social issues?
I think it's both. And this is kind of the main point I had going into this conversation is Democrats do not have an affirmative argument. I'm a person who argues for a living, and it's extremely tempting to just try to tear down your opponent's arguments. That's what Joe Biden is doing right now. He's going out there and talking about how horrible the Republican platform is, but everything that is part of the affirmative Democrat platform, people don't like. Like, let's put CRT in schools. Let's promote queer theory. Let's spend more money. The Inflation Reduction Act, which is the most preposterous name for a bill that's ever happened. Like, this is their problem on both the culture and the economy, is they're not telling the truth. And you and I have both seen this meme where it starts out with like, oh no, this thing that you're saying is happening is not happening. And then it evolves into why it's a good thing. They did it with everything. And so people cannot trust, even if the Democrats had an affirmative argument that people actually liked, by the time they get to the end of it, no one trusts them. Because they start out with CRT is not a thing. Then they're like, oh no, CRT is a good thing. Inflation is transitory. Oh, now inflation is a good thing. They just don't have anything affirmative they can put forward. And I thought Andrew Sullivan put it really well in his newsletter last week, talking about Biden. He wrote, Biden returned instead to his previous 2020 electoral blackmail. You have no choice but to vote for Democrats because the far right is so hostile to democracy. To which my answer would be, well, I did that already. That's what's going on. Is Democrats' only pitch is to say, look how bad the Republicans are. And I think that they're suffering in this election, both economically and on the culture wars, because they don't have an affirmative argument that people like.
It kind of reminds me of 2016. I mean, nobody could talk about why they liked Hillary Clinton. They would only say, you got to vote against Trump. And that was persuasive to some, but not to many. And we all know how that turned out. I mean, and this also, I like this theory that they're just going negative because they don't have anything positive to say. Because also, look at their president, look at the leader of their party. What nice things are there to say about Joe Biden right now? I mean, the guy can barely string two sentences together. And this also explains why they're going so apocalyptic with the messaging in the last couple of weeks. I mean, the Democrats there was a historian that was on MSNBC. And he said something to the effect of like, if Republicans win next week, we could see the imprisonment and maybe even the summary execution of our children. It will be an authoritarian fascist takeover. Even for MSNBC, this was like out of nowhere. And it wasn't Joy Reid. It was just some random panelist. Like you would expect this from like a Joy Reid or like Rachel Maddow, but it was just some like random panelist white guy. It was really over the top, even for these days, even for MSNBC. And I mean, I've just been, and of course, Joe Biden made basically the same speech that he made like 2 months ago. He basically just did it again. He was like, hey, let's do Joe Biden apocalypse, hold a dagger at the throat of democracy speech to Electric Boogaloo. Like, let's just do it again. Like, he just did it. I didn't even watch the whole thing. I just watched like 2 minins of it. And I was like, oh, he's doing this shit again. He's doing the fucking hold a dagger at the throat of democracy and I'll fuck you up. Like, he was like, right. I'll fuck you up like corn pop. I'll kick your ass. He's like, it's like, they're just playing they're playing the same old song and dance of hold a dagger at the throat of democracy. January 6th was the worst thing that's ever happened in the history of anything. It's worse than fucking 9/11. Like, they're just doing this shit where they're going so apocalyptic. And I keep wanting to tell them, like, guys, it's a fucking midterm. Like, it's not even a presidential you gotta chill. Donald Trump is not on the ballot. Fucking relax. Like, this comes off as unhinged.
And like, you still have the executive. Like, even if it goes the worst case scenario that Congress, both the House and the Senate, are red, you've still got the veto power. Like, why is it so bad? The level of screeching hysterics on MSNBC has reached a new high for this election, like almost higher than it was 2 years ago. Like, I really wonder about like the mental health of some of these people, particularly that panelist on MSNBC. But yeah, it's very, I wonder how this is going to turn out for the Democrats, because it feels like a boy who cried wolf phenomenon that is going to continue to hurt them. I mean, this, in 2016, I sort of understand the apocalyptic nature of the election, right? Donald Trump was a different kind of candidate. And I was also myself not particularly happy when he won. And I'm still to this day not thrilled with the fact that he was president for 4 years and would have preferred a Rubio presidency or even a fucking Ted Cruz presidency, or maybe even a Hillary Clinton presidency. I've talked about this on the show before. I don't like the fact that Trump won the 2016 election. I wish it didn't happen. So I understand why that was seen as potentially apocalyptic, because Donald Trump was seen as uniquely unfit for office. And I actually agree with that to some extent. But right now, it's a midterm. Like, it's a midterm, and they are absolutely going apeshit. But I want to go back to something that we were saying before, which was, you said it seems like Democrats should be doing better than they should be. And I think in a lot of these races they should. But one thing that I also want to say is, I said this before, both parties should be doing better in ways. The Republicans put up at least two abysmal candidates for Senate this year. If Dr. Oz and Herschel Walker were not running in highly competitive knife's edge Senate races, my prediction would be that Republicans would take control of the Senate, and I would be very confident in that prediction. Republicans would almost certainly have won in Georgia with any other candidate, and I think they would have a very good shot in Pennsylvania with almost any other candidate. And, I could still be wrong. Maybe we will have a Senator Herschel Walker or a Senator Mehmet Oz. I didn't know his name was Mehmet until he ran for Senate. But I thought his first name was Doctor.
Second, his middle name is going to be Senator now. But we'll see. But, it's like, come on. Like this, like I know I've said it on the show before. I don't want to be a broken record. I know I've talked about how terrible these two candidates are. But for fuck's sake, the Republicans had basically a free shot at the Senate, and they fucked it up. Maybe they'll still manage to squeak in there, but I think that both parties, I don't know, I think it's kind of been the story of the past few years. They're both making a lot of unforced errors. It makes me worry about 2024. There have been reports that maybe Donald Trump will announce his candidacy after Thanksgiving. Ron DeSantis he's right there. He's just right there, and he's smiling and ready to go and ready to kick Joe Biden's ass, people. And by the way, one thing you can watch for is a bellwether for the elections and for 2024. Ron DeSantis is almost, I didn't even talk about him. He's almost guaranteed to win re-election. He's looking very good on Tuesday evening. But you can look at the margin of victory for Ron DeSantis for two things. One, if he's winning by like double digits, that would indicate that maybe Democrats are going to have an even worse night than if he were only winning by, say, 5 or 6 points, which would be a little bit of a disappointment for him, I think. But also, if Ron DeSantis wins in Florida by 15%, no governor of Florida has won an election there. Nobody has won an election in Florida by more than like 4 points in the past 20 years because it's a swing state. And if DeSantis says, look, I beat Charlie Crist by 11%, like I am popular as shit, and I am also staunchly conservative in a swing state, he's making the case that, he's making the case that he's been making, which is that he is the best candidate for Republicans in 2024. I don't really parse words about this anymore on the show. I've all but endorsed DeSantis's, rising candidacy for the presidency because he's won me over. He has been wielding the power of government against wokeness very effectively. He's been avoiding some of the unforced errors of somebody like Donald Trump or fucking Herschel Walker. And this brings me to another point that I wanted to talk to you about, Ben, which is what do we think are the potential implications of the most likely scenario for the future? Like, do we think that if Republicans take control of Congress, and let's say they do win the Senate, let's say they have almost complete control of government, and they have, we know they already have the Supreme Court. They're probably going to have a large majority of governorships, even according to my own sort of somewhat modest and more sort of toned back predictions for them and their victory on Tuesday evening. If that's the case, do you think Republicans are actually going to be able to do what DeSantis has done and do something nationally and actually wield the power of government to push back in the culture war? Or do you think that some people are very skeptical of this? They think that, Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy aren't cut out for it.
Yeah. And I think this may be a place where you and I disagree, Scott, because I don't think that any of this anti-CRT, anti-queer theory, even if we got some type of federal legislation, it's going to change that much. What we have is, because let's talk about teachers, right? Teachers are a group of people who have been indoctrinated in schools of education, and these schools of education do not allow for differing viewpoints. The woke ideology is a totalizing ideology. So even if there's some legislation, some bans, I think you've even seen this, there's people are going to find a way around it. They're not going to stop thinking in this totalizing way. What Republicans should be doing once they pick up control of Congress, should they do so, is do what their roots call them to do, which is to lessen government spending, cut back on government spending, and to start doing something about the Federal Reserve, is to audit the Federal Reserve. Go back to 2010, 2012, when Ron Paul was real big. There was a movement to take care of the inflationary pressures, and if we want to talk about inflation, it has to start there. That's what they should be doing. But I think what they're going to be doing is trying to push some culture war nonsense that even if it gets through Congress, Joe Biden's going to veto. So I think it's going to, unfortunately, it will probably be a lot of running in place is what I would expect.
Yeah, I mean, my fear if they just focus on like economical stuff and kind of run of the mill, legislating, is that we get tax cuts and judges like we did under the Trump administration up until his final year where he actually started addressing critical race theory in the federal government.
Which was an executive order, not legislation.
Yeah, which was an executive order and which was immediately repealed like 3 months later because he was a terrible candidate and lost the 2020 election. But this is an interesting point of disagreement and we should delve deeper into it because I just sort of feel like, let me sort of start from the beginning here. If Republicans pick up, let's say it's a tsunami Tuesday evening, they pick up 54, maybe even 55 Senate seats. Maybe they expand the map to Colorado or Washington. I will mention very briefly, because I know this is kind of inside baseball for people who don't know how elections work, but the Senate is elected 1/3 at a time, and in 2024 there will be a new slate of senators up for election. That map really heavily favors Republicans, the 2024 Senate map. They could pick up as many as like 8 seats in the 2024 Senate elections if they play their cards right. If there's a DeSantis candidacy and that provides positive coattails, let's say, which is not an outrageous scenario, assuming Trump doesn't run, which I pray to God he does not. If they win, let's say 4 or 5 seats this time around, they win 4 or 5 seats in 2 years, they could not only have control of the Senate, they could have a filibuster-proof Senate, which is extremely rare. That's happened like once in modern history, and it was when Obama completely shellacked the Republicans in 2008. He very briefly had a filibuster-proof Senate for part of his administration. He had 60 Democratic seats. We know Republicans are in control of the Supreme Court. They're probably going to be in control of the House. And I believe that a DeSantis administration would do very well. DeSantis candidacy would do very well against Joe Biden and probably take control of the presidency. Republicans could have unrestricted control of the federal government by 2025. And that opportunity strikes me. And I know that you have somewhat more libertarian leaning, so I know this is a point of disagreement. But it's funny because I have a kind of liberal background, so I've always been like, I've always been like the state is daddy to me. I'm like, do it, daddy state, do it, fucking do the shit. I want you to do shit for me, do stuff. I want the government to do stuff. I've always been that guy, even when I was on the left, and now more when I'm on the right. I'm like, do stuff. So I feel like, especially in a situation where you get the rare opportunity, because this happens like once in a generation, to have complete filibuster proof. You can't even be filibustered. Complete control of the federal government. You have the Supreme Court, which is like, there's so many different factors that lead to you having control. They have 6 seats. It's like sort of a filibuster proof Supreme Court. The minority can do is helpless. I mean, Roe v. Wade was repealed for this reason. I'm like,
and affirmative action is about
to be, which fuck yes. I had somewhat mixed feelings about Roe v. Wade because I am, nominally pro-choice, but fuck affirmative action.
Yep.
Goodbye affirmative action and good riddance. This could, and that's a great thing. That's a great example of the victories you can have when you actually wield the power of fucking government. You don't just tax cuts and judges. Let's just be put it's like, that's what Mitch McConnell was doing for so many years when the Republicans did not have a filibuster proof Senate, but they had an almost, complete and total control of the federal government under Trump for his first 2 years, albeit they had a smaller majority in the courts, in the Supreme Court. But I view that as maybe like the last stand that we can make as a society against wokeness. Is like, what better opportunity is that? And by the way, the scenario that I described is not a pipe dream. All it requires is DeSantis wins the presidency, or some Republican wins the presidency. We do well in the Senate this evening. We do well in the Senate in 2024, which the map allows us to do. We take control of the House. That's like 3 steps. They're not hard. They're not hard, especially if you don't nominate fucking Donald Trump again. DeSantis is right there, people. He's the perfect candidate who would probably maintain some of Trump's base. He's right there. This is absolutely, I think, if Trump is nominated over DeSantis, it's snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. But anyway, back to my
Trump. Go ahead. Sorry. No.
Sorry.
Do you think Trump is dispensable? Do you think? Because to me,
an interesting question. Yeah.
To me, Donald Trump represents because now Republicans are firmly the party of the working class, and that was Trump did that. Good for him. Do you think that he is actually necessary, or do the Republicans still just need to maintain being of the working class, and Trump is just this figurehead we have, but the Republicans can move forward without him?
This is a really interesting question, and it's a good question. And my answer is, I think the only way the Republicans lose the working class is if they really actively insult them, if they nominate like a Nikki Haley or somebody who's very unpopular in the sort of more populist working class wing. I mean, Tucker Carlson has like a hate boner for Nikki Haley. He hates that woman. He's done like 3 different monologues about why she should not be president, which is interesting because I've never viewed Nikki Haley as really anything other than a kind of boring run-of-the-mill politician. Yeah, but my understanding is that the populist wing of the party does not fucking like her. And she's like number 3 or 4 on the list of, candidates for 2024. And it looks like she's going to have some issues there. But I think DeSantis strikes me as a candidate who satisfies that working class Trump base. Maybe doesn't pull them out as much as Trump does. Surely he won't, right? Nobody can run up Trump's base like Trump. But it reminds me of the song from Beauty and the Beast. No one, brings out Trump's base like Gaston, but it's like nobody can do that, right? Like nobody can bring out Trump's base like Trump, but DeSantis can do like 85% of it. You know what I mean? Like, which is enough. And at the same time, he doesn't alienate the moderates to the point that I think Trump will. I know I keep talking about it on the show, but I really can't drive it home enough how like DeSantis is just a near perfect candidate who is ready to go. He's ready. He's going to win re-election, probably by a lot this evening. I just really hope Republicans make the right choice. I really do, but it remains to be seen. But yeah, I mean, I think I don't know. I do think that it would be good to kind of to go back to what I was saying before, to take the opportunity that Republicans have as the only remaining, political bulwark against wokeness. I mean, the Democrats aren't going to do a goddamn thing. There's not going to be a party full of Tim Ryans that emerges anytime soon. Unfortunately, that's become pretty clear. I mean, Andrew Yang and Tulsi Gabbard aren't even Democrats anymore. Like these people, anyone who stands up against is just gone. Like it's done. Like the Democratic Party is forfeit. It's been completely forfeited to this ideology. I think if Republicans get complete control of government, I'm a fan of them doing stuff. And what that is, I don't know. I'm not a legislator. I haven't thought it through 100%, but I'm pretty aggressive. I've talked on this show before about doing things that affect cancel culture through the legislature that provide. And by the way, this in theory should be something that leftists like, because it's basically a labor protection. I think there should be labor protections for speech up to a certain extent. And I'll give a credit to Shoe on Head. June Lapine has, I think, been one of a few people who has said that, like, it is a leftist viewpoint to say you probably shouldn't be fired for your political views, because that's pro-labor. And I think Kyle Kulinski, also, I want to credit him. I think that he has also said something to that effect. There are people on the left who understand this should be a leftist viewpoint. But, I've been supportive of even legislation that could impact, I mean, the simplest version of it would be like adding political opinions to a list of protected classes. Because that's something that already exists. And of course, look, there's a million different problems with it that could go horribly, horribly wrong. I know that actually legislating what a private company can do when they hire and fire people is very difficult. But I'm just in favor of trying. Like, I just feel like we are down. If it's a football game, we're down 21 in the third quarter, which means our win percentage is low, but it's not zero. You can win a football game down 21 in the third quarter. It has happened. I believe it's happened a couple times, even if you're down 25 points. The Atlanta Falcons would know something about that. But you can win those games. Your win percentage is low, but you can win. And that's where I feel like the heterodoxy is right now, is that we've got to start throwing, deep balls. We've got to try. I think to just roll over and say anything we do, the wokes are just going to use their cultural dominance to overtake it, even if we start legislating on some of these issues. And look, I do think we should be smart about it. I don't think we should legislate haphazardly and in a way that the woke people can easily, deconstruct and work around. I think Chris Rufo, who I bring up a lot on the show, but I think the reason I bring him up is because I think he's done a pretty good job, not a perfect job, but a pretty good job of coming up with a somewhat sophisticated legislative framework for fighting wokeness. Not the most sophisticated, and I think he's working on it. I think he's getting better at it. But my hope is that if Republicans take control of Congress, we could see the kind of relationship that Rufo has with Ron DeSantis and other state governors, where he's been whispering in their ear and getting them to pass legislation against CRT and gender ideology. We could see that at the national level. We could see a relationship between Chris Rufo and Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy that is similar to the one he has with Ron DeSantis and many state governors. I am encouraged by that because it gives us the ability to start throwing deep balls to try and win this game, even though we're down 3 scores in the third quarter.
Hey, can I ask you a quick question about governorship since you're mentioning it? I've heard rumblings that New York could go red on the governorship race. So I was curious about your opinion about this. This
is a good segue. I'm not going to talk about all the competitive governorships. I'm going to talk about the ones that I think are most interesting. But I do have a governor map. So let me talk about it, and I will talk about New York. Let's start with New York since you asked about it, Ben. So my prediction for the governorships, which is a big deal, by the way, there's the lion's share of governorships are up in midterm years. So we're not just electing a Congress. And since this is the election day special, I might as well talk about the governorships too. They are important. The odds are your governor is up for election in this election. I think there's 14 states that do off year or presidential year governor elections. So 36 are up. You asked me about New York. I absolutely think Kathy Hochul is going to win re-election in New York. She is the lieutenant governor who took over when Andrew Cuomo was accused of sexual misconduct, somewhat speciously, it would seem, but that's kind of neither here nor there. And I mean, the polling was looking great, as you would expect for a Democrat in New York. She was up by like 15, 20 points. And then it narrowed to, I think, something like 6 or 7 points in the last couple of weeks. So there's a lot of momentum for the Republican Lee Zeldin, who is a pretty talented, pretty reasonable, I think he's actually a Jewish Republican, which is kind of interesting. There's not a lot of those in Congress. So Lee Zeldin's a pretty interesting candidate in New York, the Republican candidate. And he's doing really well for a Republican in New York. There's a strong chance he could come a lot closer to winning that race than he ought to. And there is a outside chance he could win it. It wouldn't be the biggest polling error I've ever seen. I've seen polling errors as big as like 7-8%, before. That's about as big as I've seen, but it wouldn't be outside of that range. So that is another one where, in New York, they usually take a long time to count their votes because the Board of Elections there is dog shit. But but it's on the East Coast, and its polls will close fairly early for the compared to the rest of the country. Watch the returns there if they are coming in at a reasonable rate this time. And if Lee Zeldin is even within 2 or 3 points of Kathy Hochul, that is a sign that a Republican wave is incoming. But in my predictions, I do have that being maintained by the Democrats. Pennsylvania is probably the best case of Republicans putting up a candidate that disqualified them, Doug Mastriano. He's a fucking terrible candidate. And once again, the Republicans did this a few years ago as well. Pennsylvania's got 20 electoral votes. It's a big fucking state. And Republicans keep flubbing the governor elections there. They could have won that one, but they put up a terrible Trump-endorsed candidate who just is not going to win. Josh Shapiro, the Democrat, will be the next governor of Pennsylvania, unless something really, really crazy happens on Tuesday. Josh Shapiro will be the Democratic governor of Pennsylvania. Georgia, the Democrats actually put up a terrible candidate there, Stacey Abrams. I've talked about her on the show before. She believes in election
denier.
Yeah, election denier Stacey Abrams, who thinks she won the governorship in 2018 the first time she ran. Yeah, fuck her. She is going to probably lose this evening. This is being recorded on Saturday the 5th, so I keep having to trick myself into saying this evening because it's going to come out Tuesday morning. So she's going to lose. Brian Kemp's going to get reelected in Georgia. Ron DeSantis is going to get reelected in Florida. Wisconsin's really close. Wisconsin is an incumbent Democrat. Right now I have it going to the Republicans, but that's a really close one that might change in my final map. Michigan and New Mexico are both interesting because Democrats have like smaller leads than they should have in both of those. Michigan is interesting because the main Republican candidate there actually got disqualified from the ballot, and they ended up having to go with like a backbencher candidate. There were signature issues with, I think he was the former chief of Detroit police. That was a crazy one. And I do think that that's going to end up costing Republicans the governorship there. But it's an interesting race. It's fairly close. I do think Democrats will win in Michigan governorship. I think they're going to win.
Whitmer's a subject of controversy because of how draconian Michigan's COVID policies were.
Yeah, she's not popular, and she could maybe. That's another one that goes in the Republican wave category. Republican wave means they would actually win the governorship in Michigan, possibly New Mexico. Texas, good old Beto is Beto, however you pronounce his fucking name. He's running in Texas, and he's going to lose very badly. He ran a really close race, to his credit, Beto O'Rourke, against Ted Cruz in 2018. I think that will remain his shining moment for the rest of his political career. He did not do well in the 2020 Democratic primaries. I think he dropped out before Iowa. And he's not going to win the Texas governorship unless something pretty fucking crazy happens this evening. Kansas is really, really interesting. There's a moderate Democratic governor who managed to win in the kind of Democratic statewide wave that was going on in 2018. Nate Silver has her winning pretty solidly, and I actually have her losing. This is one where I disagree with the conventional wisdom. I feel like in a Republican year, in a Republican state, with a Republican candidate who I think is the incumbent attorney general and is not particularly controversial as I understand it. I think his last name is Schmidt. But I can't remember. But he's a generic Republican, more or less. I could see Laura Kelly winning re-election. This is one where I know I'm going out on a limb. But at the end of the day, I feel this is where I'm going with my gut, and I think that Republicans will retake the governorship in Kansas. Arizona is really cool and interesting. Carrie Lake has turned out to be kind of a fascinating candidate because she is pretty far to the right. She's, I think, played footsies with the election conspiracies of Donald Trump, but she has not fully, dove into them like Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania. And I think because of that, she's favored to win. And I do think she will win against a pretty generic Democrat, someone named Katie Hobbs, who I think worked in the education field.
Race.
It's I think within 2 or 3 points in the polling average.
According to 538, I'm looking at it right now. It's like 1.6, something like that.
I think that at the end of the day, what makes the most sense to me for this cycle is that the 2 statewide races in Arizona would get split. I think that it'll go half and half. I think that Blake Masters will probably lose the Senate race, but I think Lake has just run maybe a somewhat more effective campaign. She's got a much weaker opponent. Masters is running against Mark Kelly, who's just a much better opponent than Carrie Lake's opponent. I do think that Republicans will win the governorship in Arizona. Nevada was the last one I did on my map. I have no idea really who's going to win the Nevada governorship. Right now, I say the Republican Joe Lombardo. this is as close to a toss-up as it can be. For me, it's like completely 50-50. Nevada is a swing state. There's I think a not particularly problematic Democratic incumbent there. There's a somewhat, conservative, Republican candidate, but he's not particularly controversial. There's not a ton of polling in these kind of smaller states. That race, I believe Joe Lombardo is leading narrowly in the polls, and I'm just going to kind of go with what the polls say because I'm not sure what to make of the Nevada governor's race. But right now I have Joe Lombardo winning for the Republicans. Oregon is the last one I want to talk about. Oregon is really cool. Oregon is doing something very interesting right now, which is that there's 3 candidates for governor. There is an independent who leans to the left, I think at least slightly, who is running and who is siphoning off Democratic votes. And so Oregon could elect their first Republican governor in like 20, 30 years. And I think they're going to. I actually think that in a Republican year where you have this kind of nightmare scenario for Democrats, where you have a strong third-party candidate siphoning off Dem votes, I do think that the Republican is actually going to win that race. That's one that, is also kind of 50-50. The Democrats could maybe, pull it off still with this third party candidate siphoning off votes. But that's a cool one that if you guys are interested in elections at all that you're listening, Oregon is just a really fascinating election right now because there's 3 candidates, which is very unusual. That happens like kind of every once in a while that an independent actually siphons off, I think like something like 7 to 12% of the vote is going to this third-party candidate.
538 says 12.5% is this Betsy Johnson third-party candidate.
And let's say 75% of that is Democratic, that's 9 points that the Democrat could certainly use because in the polling average, I think it's like a dead heat. I do think that Republicans are going to win that race. So at the end of the day, I think Republicans are going to control 29 or 30, depending on Nevada, governorships. I'm going to say 30 for this, but again, my final maps will be up on my Twitter. I think that Republicans will control 30 governorships when all is said and done. That's a really big bright spot for them because in the 2023, next year's off-year elections, there are Democratic governorships that are up for re-election in Louisiana and Kentucky, which could be rough if there's a recession, which is likely to take place that year. And so they could go up to 32. Let's say my predictions are right. Republicans could have as many as 32 governorships out of 50. Democrats could be reduced to 18 governorships by 2024. So that's the governor election predictions. Again, I'll try to put the map up on the screen for y'all so you can see it. And it'll be up on my Twitter Monday night, the final version, which again, might be slightly different than what I talked about on the show today. But Ben, what do you think of all that?
It's going to be a fun Tuesday night. I'll be sitting back. I'll have a little tequila and see how our country's going to be governed going forward. I do think that Republicans are going to have a good night because the Democrats have they just don't have it. They don't have a message that people want to stick with. And while the Republicans are seeming like the party that's not being restrictive. Like I remember back when like George W. Bush days, when conservatives were the ones who were like, you shouldn't watch, horrible movies that have sex and violence. And, they were thought of as like this restrictive party. And now that's the Democrats. The Democrats are the ones who are restricting our culture, and they just don't have the affirmative case to the American people. And I think that's why we're going to see a red ripple wave tsunami, whatever it is, because the Democrats have just failed to be able to both have an affirmative argument and to tell the truth about what their actual argument is.
I think it's an interesting point. I think it's true that the Democrats have kind of become the scolds of modern culture. But I will point out that Republicans did manage to win an awful lot of elections when they were the scolds. I mean, there was the whole moral majority of the 1980s. And that's what I feel. I mean, that's what happened, I think, in 2018, is that there was a huge influx of social justice oriented activism in between 2016 and 2018 that did help the Democrats, I think. Because it was before there was really any effective pushback. I mean, that 2018 is when you had people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez being elected, primarying successfully, longtime Democratic establishment lawmakers. So I don't know exactly what's going to happen on Tuesday. I suspect it's going to be a good night for Republicans. I hope it's a great night for Republicans. I will announce on the show, this is the first year I think I'm going to not split my ticket. And it's because I'm voting exclusively Republican. And I've never done that before in my entire adult life. I have split my ticket every time I have gone to vote in any election. I've always voted for, even when I was a hardcore Democrat, I always voted for at least one Republican. There were some local Republicans in my hometown that I liked. And when, I've split my ticket the last couple of years. I think last time I at least wrote in some people. I don't know if I actually voted for any Democrats in 2020. But I at least wrote in a couple of people. Well, actually, you know what? I definitely did, because Tulsi Gabbard was a Democrat at the time, and I wrote her in for president. So I did vote for a Democrat. And this time, just with what's happened to Kyle Rittenhouse, with what's been going on for the past couple of years, with everything that's going on right now with the way that Democrats are treating children in schools, yeah. I can't stomach to vote for anyone that is not explicitly anti-woke. Maybe if I was in Ohio, I'd vote for somebody like Tim Ryan, right? But I'm not in Ohio. That narrows it. If you're trying to dox me now, there's 49 states left on your. It's like people are trying to figure out where the Simpsons live. It's like, but so it's not Ohio, but it could be any. It could be any out of the 49 states. I don't live in Ohio. It'd be kind of cool if I did, because it's a swing state. But it's pretty interesting when I think about my political evolution for the past several years, that I've gotten to a point where I will not even really consider voting for a Democrat. And I'm going to vote straight ticket Republican when I go to the polls, and I will be voting in person on election day. But I think that'll do it for this election morning special, election night special, whatever you want to call it. Some people might watch it at night. They'll probably be watching the returns at night. Let's call it the election morning special. That'll do it for this election morning special of the Veritas Podcast. We appreciate everyone joining us today and hearing the predictions and everything. Again, my final predictions. Don't make fun of me if these predictions are wrong, because my finals will be on Twitter. Make fun of those if those are wrong. But I'm going to update them a little bit. Again, it's at Scott_Veritas on Twitter. And we appreciate you guys being with us. Tuesday is going to be a really, really big night. Hopefully a good night for the heterodoxy, where there are some opportunities to push back on wokeness. Thanks again for being here. Thanks to Ben for joining me today. We'll see you guys next time on the Veritas Podcast.